Tonight, we're not here to fix anything, not to understand everything, not to become someone better before you're allowed to rest. This is a quiet space where we gently let go and return to inner peace through soft Zen stories inspired by the Buddha, shared slowly so your mind can soften and your body can rest. Maybe today asked a little too much from you. Too many thoughts, too many worries, too many small things you tried to hold together. And maybe, just for this moment, you're ready to set them down. Here, you don't need to improve yourself. You don't need to solve tomorrow. You are already enough simply by being here, breathing quietly. Just for a moment. Where are you listening from tonight? Wherever you are, I'm grateful you're here, sharing this quiet space. Let your breath slow, as if it remembers the way home. Let your shoulders soften, like they no longer need to carry the world. Tonight, we'll listen to a simple story. A story from ordinary life, carrying a small thread of Zen and Buddhist wisdom. Not to give you more to think about, but to help you loosen your grip. Because suffering rarely ends by force. It softens when we stop holding it so tightly. There's nothing to rush, nothing to achieve, only a gentle drifting into rest, into stillness. Whether you stay awake or slowly fall asleep, this moment is already enough. And now, we begin tonight's journey with these Zen stories. It felt tight long before it felt meaningful. Not the kind of tightness that hurts right away, but the slow, constant kind. Like wearing a jacket that's one size too small, and telling yourself you'll get used to it. At first, it's just uncomfortable. Later, it's all you can think about. The room was warm, too warm. Laundry machines lined the wall, humming and thumping in steady cycles. The air smelled faintly of detergent and hot fabric. Chairs sat empty, facing nowhere in particular. Clothes moved in circles behind glass doors, over and over again. The rhythm was predictable, almost soothing if you didn't look at it for too long. Sitting there, a basket of folded clothes rested at the feet. Everything was clean, everything was in order, and still there was a sense of being trapped inside something invisible. The day had been full, not dramatic, just full. Messages answered, tasks completed, responsibilities met without complaint. The kind of day that looks fine from the outside. Inside, it felt like shrinking. There was a thought that came up often lately. I don't have room to breathe. It wasn't about physical space. The laundromat wasn't crowded. The chair wasn't uncomfortable. It was about the sense that every part of life had already been assigned a purpose. Every hour accounted for, every expectation wrapped tightly around the next, like being sealed into a shape that no longer fit. The dryer beeped softly. The sound cut through the hum, then disappeared again. The cycle continued. Fear showed up in a subtle way here. Not as panic, but as impatience. As frustration with being stuck. as the worry that this tightness was permanent. What if this is it? What if there's no expansion coming? The idea pressed inward, making the chest feel smaller. Hands reached down and picked up a sweater. It was warm from the dryer, heavier than expected. Folding it required attention, sleeves aligned, fabric smoothed. The simple motion grounded the body in something tangible. As the sweater was placed on the pile, it became obvious how much pressure had been placed on movement lately. On progress, on visible change. But nothing in the room was in a hurry. The machines kept turning at their own pace. Clothes didn't resist being tumbled. They didn't worry about where they were going next. Sitting back again, attention returned to the feeling of constriction. It wasn't evenly spread. It lived mostly in the chest and shoulders, like a shell being formed around something soft. The image arrived without effort. A cocoon. Not the romantic version, not the triumphant before and after. The uncomfortable middle. The part where nothing looks like growth. Where movement feels restricted and the future shape is unknown. A cocoon isn't spacious, it's protective. That thought didn't immediately bring relief. Protection still felt like confinement, still felt limiting, still felt like being held in place when all the mind wanted was escape. Another dryer beeped. Someone down the row moved clothes from washer to dryer, then left again. The room returned to its steady rhythm. It became clear how often fear mistakes preparation for punishment. As if being held tightly must mean something has gone wrong. As if comfort and growth are supposed to look the same. But growth doesn't ask for permission. It often asks for patience. The cocoon isn't built to last forever. It's built to hold a process that can't happen in open air. Soft things need structure before they can support themselves. The idea settled slowly, not as an answer, but as a possibility. The tightness in the chest didn't disappear, but it shifted. It felt less hostile, less like a trap, and more like a pause with purpose. Hands reached for another piece of clothing, a t-shirt this time, lighter, easier to fold. The warmth faded quickly as it was exposed to the cooler air. The body noticed that too. How quickly heat changes when conditions change. How nothing stays exactly the same for long. The fear of being stuck began to loosen just slightly. Not because the situation had changed, but because the meaning had. Maybe this wasn't stagnation. Maybe it was containment. Maybe the discomfort wasn't a signal to break free, but a sign that something inside was reorganizing. Quietly, without spectacle. The basket filled. The machines slowed toward the end of their cycles. The room stayed warm, but the body felt steadier. The cocoon hadn't opened, but it didn't need to yet. For now, it was enough to sit in the tightness without fighting it, to trust that pressure wasn't always the enemy, that some transformations required darkness, stillness, and time. The dryers clicked and stopped. Silence settled briefly before the hum resumed elsewhere. And in that pause, the idea remained. This might not be the end of movement. It might be the middle. Later, the tightness showed up in smaller ways, not as pressure this time, but as slowness. Movements felt deliberate, Even simple things took a little longer than usual, like the body was insisting on a different pace. At home, the lights were low. The day had finally released its grip, but the feeling of being enclosed hadn't vanished with it. It followed quietly, settling into the chest, the back, the spaces between thoughts. Fear returned too, but softer now. Less demanding, more curious. It asked whether this waiting had a purpose, whether the stillness was leading somewhere, or if it was just another form of delay. Sitting on the edge of the bed, attention dropped inward. The breath moved shallowly at first, then deeper, as if it had been given permission. The body felt dense, compact, like it had been wrapped carefully from the inside out. A cocoon doesn't look like progress from the outside. It looks like nothing is happening. That's what makes it uncomfortable. The mind prefers visible motion. It likes evidence. It wants proof that effort is paying off. A cocoon offers none of that. It asks for trust without explanation. Lying down, the body curled slightly instinctively. Knees bent, arms drawn in. The position felt natural, even though it mirrored the very thing that had felt restrictive earlier. Protection doesn't always feel expansive. Sometimes it feels like being held. The thought settled slowly. The cocoon wasn't meant to be roomy. It was meant to be precise, shaped exactly for what was forming inside it. Growth here wasn't about adding more. It was about rearranging what already existed. Fear had been warning that this phase meant losing freedom. But freedom doesn't disappear inside a cocoon. It just waits for structure. Wings don't form in open air. They need pressure, boundaries, time. That realization didn't arrive as comfort. It arrived as clarity. The body wasn't being punished. It was being prepared. Muscles relaxed incrementally. The breath deepened again. The feeling of being trapped softened into a sense of being contained, supported even. Outside, the world kept moving. Cars passed. Lights flicked on and off in distant windows. Life didn't pause to check whether this moment felt meaningful. Inside, something quieter was happening. Fear had insisted that the tightness meant something was wrong. That ease should come first, and struggle meant failure. But the body knew better. It had learned this before in other forms. Strength comes after resistance. Flexibility follows tension. Flight begins with compression. The cocoon doesn't rush its work. It doesn't try to open early. Doing so would ruin the process. That felt important too. There was no need to escape this phase. No need to tear through the walls of it just to feel relief. Relief would come when the structure was ready to fall away on its own. Until then, the work was internal, invisible, slow. The body shifted again, finding a more comfortable position without fully stretching out. Even comfort respected the boundaries right now. Sleep approached gently without urgency. The fear of being stuck faded further into the background. Not because answers had appeared, but because the question itself had changed. Instead of asking, "When will this end?" something quieter asked, "What is being formed?" The cocoon didn't answer. It didn't need to. Its job was not to explain, but to hold. As sleep settled in, there was a subtle trust growing beneath the surface. A trust that pressure had a reason, that stillness wasn't stagnation, that this tight enclosed moment was not the opposite of freedom, but part of its construction. The cocoon stayed intact through the night, and that was exactly as it should be. Whatever wings were coming didn't need to be imagined yet. For now, it was enough to rest inside the shape that was making them possible. It didn't feel like a loss at first. It felt like a wrong turn. The kind that happens quietly without alarms or clear mistakes. One moment everything seems to be moving in the right direction. The next something expected simply isn't there anymore. The drive had started normally. Late afternoon light traffic moving slowly but steadily, the familiar stretch of road that usually led straight through. The GPS was on, not because it was needed, but because it felt reassuring to see the line drawn clearly ahead. Then the notification appeared. Route unavailable. Detour ahead. The screen adjusted instantly, redrawing lines offering alternatives that felt longer and less certain. The main route, the one that made sense, was gone. The body reacted before the mind formed a thought. A tightening in the chest, a slight clench in the hands on the steering wheel. Not anger, not panic, just resistance. This wasn't part of the plan. Traffic slowed further. Brake lights stretched ahead like a warning. The road sign confirmed it. The bridge up ahead was closed. Construction, indefinite timeline. The bridge had always been there. Reliable, unquestioned. Seeing it closed felt strangely personal, as if something dependable had been taken away without explanation. The idea of having to go around brought up irritation, then something softer beneath it, uncertainty. The GPS suggested a side road, narrower, less familiar. It added minutes to the drive, maybe more. The mind immediately calculated the inconvenience, the wasted time, the disruption. Fear slipped in quietly. What if this detour leads nowhere? What if it makes things worse? The instinct was to wait, to pull over, to check for updates, to see if the bridge might reopen sooner than expected. Waiting felt safer than choosing a route that hadn't been tested. But cars behind kept moving. The moment didn't allow for long hesitation. The turn signal clicked on. The wheel turned. The car left the main road and entered a quieter street lined with older houses and tall trees. The change was immediate. Fewer cars, less noise. A different rhythm altogether. At first, the unfamiliarity felt uncomfortable. The landmarks were gone. The mental map no longer applied. Every intersection required attention instead of autopilot. The body stayed tense, alert for signs of trouble. The mind watched closely, ready to label the choice a mistake. But nothing went wrong. The road held. The car moved forward. The world continued. As the drive went on, something subtle shifted. Without the pressure of the main route, the pace slowed naturally. The shoulders dropped a fraction, the breath deepened. The detour wasn't empty. It was just different. Sunlight filtered through the trees, creating moving patterns across the windshield. Houses passed by each one quietly, lived in each one part of a world that didn't exist on the highway. The fear that had insisted this was a setback began to lose its urgency. The bridge being closed hadn't stopped the journey. It had simply changed its shape. That realization didn't arrive as comfort. It arrived as surprise. How often does fear assume that the shortest path is the only valid one? That efficiency equals correctness. That deviation means failure. The broken bridge hadn't been a judgment. It hadn't been a punishment. It was just a condition. Eventually, the GPS adjusted again, guiding the car back toward a larger road. The estimated arrival time had shifted, but not drastically. Life hadn't collapsed because one structure was unavailable. The detour merged back into movement. There was still a sense of loss. The original route had been easier, familiar, predictable. But something else had been gained too, even if it couldn't be named yet. The body noticed less urgency now, less need to force arrival. The bridge remained closed somewhere behind, unused, out of reach. And maybe that was okay. For now the road ahead existed. It might be longer. It might be less direct. But it was still a road. Later, the broken bridge showed up again, even without the car. It appeared in smaller moments, in plans that didn't line up the way they were supposed to, in expectations that quietly fell apart without anyone to blame, in that familiar pause when something dependable suddenly wasn't available anymore. Fear recognized the pattern immediately. This wasn't the route. It brought back the same tension as before, the same urge to stop to wait to see if things might return to how they were. Because going back felt easier than continuing forward without a clear map. But there was another memory now too. The side road, the trees, the quiet stretch that hadn't existed in the original plan. That memory softened the reaction. Not every detour announces itself with signs and cones. Some show up as closed doors, canceled options, shifts that leave you standing still longer than expected. The mind labels them all the same way: interruption. But interruption doesn't always mean obstruction. Sometimes it means redirection. Sitting quietly later that evening, the body noticed how much effort goes into maintaining a single idea of progress. How tightly plans are held, not because they're perfect, but because they're familiar. The bridge felt safe because it had been crossed so many times before. Its absence had triggered fear, not because the destination was gone, but because the method was. That felt important. Fear often disguises itself as loyalty to the plan. It insists that changing course means abandoning intention, that staying true requires staying the same. But the detour hadn't erased the destination. It had only asked for flexibility. The body remembered how attention had sharpened on the side road, how presence had increased once autopilot ended, how movement had become more conscious, more alive. Maybe the bridge breaking wasn't a failure of structure. Maybe it was an invitation to wake up. The idea didn't demand agreement. It simply existed as another way of seeing what had happened. Plans are built on assumptions. Roads stay open. Bridges remain intact. Conditions don't shift unexpectedly. When those assumptions break, fear rushes in to fill the gap, warning of loss and delay. But delay isn't always a setback. Sometimes it's a buffer. A pause that prevents something worse. A slower pace that allows adjustment. A longer path that teaches endurance. The detour had asked for patience. It had also offered something unexpected, a sense of agency. Choosing the unfamiliar route had required trust in the moment, not in the map. That trust didn't feel dramatic. It felt practical. You turn, you drive, you respond. Life rarely asks for certainty. It asks for participation. The broken bridge hadn't demanded a new identity or a grand decision. It had only asked for a willingness to keep moving without guarantees. That willingness lingered now, even off the road. When another small plan fell through a meeting rescheduled, a timeline adjusted. The body noticed the reaction earlier than usual. The tightening, the resistance, and then the release. There were other roads. There always were. They might not be visible right away. They might require slowing down, paying closer attention, letting go of efficiency for a while. But they existed. The bridge remained broken somewhere out of sight. Construction crews would fix it eventually, or they wouldn't. Either way, the world had already adapted. The journey continued, not in spite of the detour, but through it. That felt like the quiet lesson hidden in the delay. When the direct path disappears, it doesn't mean you've lost your way. It means you're being asked to find it differently, and finding it differently doesn't make it less real. It just makes it new. The body settled into rest that night, without needing the map to resolve itself. The road ahead didn't have to be known yet. It only had to be walked or driven one stretch at a time. The bridge being broken no longer felt like a threat. It felt like a reminder. Sometimes the fastest way forward is the way that teaches you how to keep going when the old way is no longer available. And that quietly was enough. There's a certain kind of darkness that feels heavier than the rest. Not because it's louder or more frightening, but because it comes after you've already been tired for a long time. The kind that shows up when you've been holding on, telling yourself you just need to get through a little more. The break room was quiet. Not silent, just muted. A vending machine hummed steadily against the far wall, its lights too bright for the hour. A clock ticked above the sink, each second landing clearly in the still air. It was late. Or early. The difference had stopped mattering. A paper cup sat on the table, filled with tea that had already gone lukewarm. Steam had disappeared a while ago, but the cup was still warm enough to hold between both hands. That small warmth felt important. The shift wasn't over yet, but it was close. That was the hard part. When the end is far away, endurance feels possible. You settle in. You pace yourself. But when the finish line is almost visible, the body seems to notice how much it has already spent. The fatigue moved differently now. Heavier in the limbs, thicker behind the eyes. Thoughts slowed not into calm, but into something dull and resistant. Fear crept in quietly, disguised as doubt. What if this never gets easier? What if this is just how it feels now? The idea didn't shout. It didn't need to. It landed softly and spread. Outside the small window, the sky was still dark. Not the deep black of midnight, but a softer shade that hinted at change without offering proof. Streetlights reflected off damp pavement. Everything looked paused, as if waiting for permission to move again. The body leaned back in the chair. The plastic creaked in response. The sound felt too loud in the quiet room. There was an urge to check the time again, even though it had just been checked. To measure how much was left. To calculate whether the energy would hold. But the numbers didn't help. The darkness felt personal in moments like this. As if it were saying something about endurance, about limits, about whether the effort had been worth it. The vending machine clicked softly, then went back to humming. The clock kept ticking. The room didn't care about the story forming in the mind. That was noticeable. Nothing in the space suggested danger, no alarms, no emergencies, just tiredness doing what tiredness does when it's been stretched thin. The cup was lifted again, a small sip. The taste was faint now, but still there. The warmth traveled down slowly. There was a memory of other moments like this. Different nights, different rooms. The same feeling of being right at the edge of something breaking or changing. It was always hardest right before relief arrived. But in the moment, that pattern was easy to forget. Fear thrives in that forgetting. It convinces you that the current state is permanent, that the darkness has no direction. But darkness isn't static. It moves even when it looks still. The sky outside the window shifted almost imperceptibly. A fraction lighter near the horizon. So subtle it could be missed if you weren't looking for it. The body noticed before the mind did. A slight easing in the chest, a breath that went deeper without effort. The shift didn't fix the fatigue. It didn't erase the heaviness. But it changed the quality of it. The tiredness felt less hopeless, more transitional. This wasn't collapse. It was completion approaching. The thought didn't bring excitement. It brought steadiness. The hardest part of the night wasn't proof of failure. It was proof of proximity. The body was tired because it had carried something all the way here. The clock ticked again. The vending machine hummed. The tea cooled further. Outside, the sky continued its slow, patient change. Nothing dramatic happened. Nothing needed to. The darkness was still there, but it no longer felt endless. It felt like the moment just before something shifts. And for now, that was enough to keep sitting, enough to keep breathing, enough to stay. The darkness didn't lift all at once. It loosened. At first, it was barely noticeable, a soft thinning near the edges like a shadow pulling back without announcing itself. The sky outside the window shifted from black to something gentler, a deep blue that suggested change without confirming it. Inside the break room, nothing else moved. The vending machine hummed the same low note. The clock kept its steady pace. The cup sat empty now, warmth long gone, but still held between both hands as if it could remember what heat felt like. Fatigue settled deeper into the body, but it changed texture. Earlier, it had felt sharp, almost brittle. Now it felt heavier, slower, as if it were ready to be set down instead of fought against. Fear tried once more to make meaning of the moment. It asked whether this heaviness was a sign of reaching a limit. whether something important had been used up for good. But the body didn't answer. The body had learned something over many nights like this. That exhaustion at this hour doesn't signal danger. It signals closeness. The end of effort, not the failure of it. The sky outside grew lighter by degrees. No sudden reveal, just patience. A quiet insistence that morning didn't need permission to arrive. That felt important. So much fear comes from the belief that relief must be earned through vigilance. That if you stop watching closely, something bad will happen. But morning doesn't require attention. It comes whether it's expected or not. The room felt different now, though nothing in it had changed. The walls seemed less confining. The hum of the machine less intrusive. The ticking clock no longer sounded like a countdown. The body noticed a small shift in posture. The spine straightened slightly. The shoulders rolled back not because they were told to, but because they were ready. Outside, the horizon softened. The sharp contrast between dark and light blurred into a gradient. The streetlights still burned, but their authority had faded. Fear had nothing new to say. It had warned that the night would last forever. It had insisted that this tiredness meant something was wrong. But the sky offered quiet evidence to the contrary. Darkness hadn't been a mistake. It had been a phase. The thought settled without ceremony. No triumph. No lesson to remember. Just a sense of things moving as they always had, even when it felt otherwise. The cup was set down. Hands rested on the table. The body leaned forward slightly, readying itself for the next small task. Not energized, just capable. The hardest hour had passed. Not because anything dramatic happened, but because time had done what it does. It moved. Slowly, reliably. The sky outside was unmistakably lighter now. Not bright, not warm, but clearly changing. Morning was on its way. The realization didn't bring joy. It brought relief. The quiet kind that doesn't ask to be shared. The kind that allows the body to stop bracing. Fear slipped away, not defeated, just unnecessary. There would be more nights like this, more stretches of darkness that felt endless while they lasted. But there would also be more mornings arriving without being summoned. The body breathed in, breathed out. The shift ended soon after. The room filled with movement again, footsteps, voices, the ordinary noise of a day beginning. But for a moment longer there was stillness. The memory of this hour stayed not as a warning, but as reassurance. When things feel darkest, it doesn't mean you've missed the light. It often means you're closer to it than you think. And you don't have to force the sky to change. You only have to stay. That was enough. Strength is often imagined as resistance, as standing firm, as pushing back. But there is another kind of strength that doesn't look impressive at first glance. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't raise its voice. It just keeps growing. That evening, the walk home was slower than usual. The street was quiet, lined with small houses and trees that had seen better days. Porch lights were already on, casting soft circles onto the sidewalk. Somewhere nearby, a dog barked once and then went silent again. The path cut through a narrow strip of grass between the sidewalk and the curb. It had been stepped on all day. By people rushing to cars, by delivery workers, by kids cutting corners. The blades were bent flattened, pressed close to the soil. It would have been easy to miss. The irritation from earlier in the day hadn't gone anywhere. A customer's tone, a comment that carried more edge than necessary. The kind of interaction that leaves a residue long after it's over. Nothing loud, nothing dramatic, just disrespect dressed as normal conversation. Anger rose in the familiar way. Tight shoulders, faster steps. The mind replaying what should have been said instead. I should have pushed back. I shouldn't let people talk to me like that. Why do I always swallow it? The anger felt justified, necessary even, like proof of self-respect. A foot stepped off the sidewalk and onto the grass without thinking. The ground was soft from recent rain. The blades folded under the weight, easily offering no resistance at all. That felt irritating too. The mind noticed the parallel immediately and didn't like it. Being flexible gets mistaken for being weak. Yielding gets confused with losing. Not reacting gets labeled as failure. The anger leaned into that story. You let them walk all over you. The foot lifted again. Another step. More grass pressed down. And then something small happened. A breeze moved through the street, barely noticeable, enough to stir the leaves in the trees, enough to ripple through the grass. The blades that had been flattened didn't spring back instantly. They took their time, slowly, quietly. But they did rise, not all the way, not perfectly, but enough to stand again. That image stayed. The walk continued. The irritation didn't disappear, but it softened at the edges. It became possible to feel what was underneath it. Embarrassment. The wish to be treated with care. The old fear that being calm means being overlooked. Anger often stands in front of those feelings. It makes itself large so the softer parts don't have to be seen. A car passed, headlights sweeping briefly across the grass. For a second, the bent blades caught the light bright against the darker soil. Then, the light moved on. The grass didn't chase it. There was a memory of another time years ago when anger had been expressed loudly. When words had been sharp and precise, when the response had been immediate silence. It had felt like winning for about 5 minutes. Later, there had been distance, awkwardness, a relationship that never quite returned to its earlier ease. The anger from today wanted a similar release, a sharp message, a pointed comment next time. A line drawn in permanent ink. But the image of the grass lingered. Grass doesn't grow by fighting the foot. It grows by staying rooted, by bending when needed, by using pressure as information, not instruction. That didn't mean letting harm continue. It didn't mean accepting disrespect. It just meant recognizing that immediate retaliation isn't the only form of strength. The walk slowed even more. The steps became deliberate. The breath matched the pace. The irritation loosened enough to notice something else: fatigue. Not just physical, but emotional. The tiredness that comes from bracing all the time. Anger requires effort. It keeps the system alert, ready to defend. Yielding when chosen consciously can be restful. Another step onto the grass, another bend, another slow return. The thought came quietly. What if I don't have to harden to survive this? It wasn't a conclusion, just a question. The house came into view. The porch light was already on. The door was still closed. The day wasn't resolved. The interaction hadn't been addressed. Nothing had been fixed. But the body felt different than it had an hour ago. Less braced, less sharp. The grass behind lay slightly flattened, already beginning its slow return. Not defeated, just alive. The next day didn't arrive with clarity. It arrived with routine. Morning light came in through the window at an angle that made dust visible. Coffee brewed, shoes were tied, the body moved through familiar motions while the mind stayed half a step behind. The memory of yesterday's interaction was still there, but it felt different now. Less sharp, less demanding. Like something that could be looked at without flinching. Later, it happened again. Not the same person, not the same words, just a similar tone, slightly dismissive, slightly rushed. The kind of tone that suggests your presence is an inconvenience. The familiar surge rose up. This time it was noticed earlier. Before the shoulders tightened, before the jaw set. The body remembered the grass. There was a moment, small, almost invisible, where a choice appeared. Not between fighting and surrendering, but between reacting and responding. The words came out calmly. Not soft, not apologetic, just clear, short, measured. Nothing dramatic happened. The other person paused, adjusted, moved on. No apology, no acknowledgement. Just a subtle shift in the air, like pressure changing slightly. That surprised the anger. It had expected a battle or a collapse. Instead, there was neither. Later, walking again, the path passed the same strip of grass. More footprints now, more bending, more quiet recovery. It became clearer then that being like grass didn't mean allowing harm. It meant staying rooted while adapting. It meant choosing flexibility without losing direction. Anger often insists that strength must be loud to be real. But loud strength burns quickly. It needs constant fuel. The strength of the grass doesn't exhaust itself proving anything. There was relief in that realization, a subtle one. The kind that doesn't announce itself but stays. The irritation from the day didn't need to be carried home. It didn't need to be rehearsed or sharpened. It could be set down. That night, the body felt less braced. Sleep came without replay. The grass outside continued its quiet work, not because it was weak, but because it knew how to live. Anger doesn't always need a target. Sometimes it just needs a place to bounce. That night, the room was quiet enough to hear the low hum of electricity in the walls. A single lamp was on. The rest of the apartment stayed dim. Outside, the city moved at a distance reduced to muffled sound and light. The phone lay in one hand, screen glowing softly. A message had been read earlier, not sent to this person directly. Just something seen in passing. A comment, a post. A few careless words stacked together and released into the world. It wasn't personal, and yet it felt personal. The words had a sharpness to them, a tone that suggested judgment, superiority, a casual cruelty disguised as honesty. Anger rose quickly, not slowly this time. It felt immediate, reflexive. The thumb hovered over the screen, already forming a response. The mind knew exactly what to say. It had sentences ready, clear, cutting, clever in the way that feels satisfying later in the shower. This wasn't about fixing anything. It was about answering. About not letting something stand uncontested. The room stayed silent. The phone buzzed faintly with other notifications. None of them mattered. The urge to respond felt clean, almost virtuous. If I don't say something, this kind of talk just keeps spreading. Anger is good at borrowing moral language. The comment was read again, then again, each time it seemed worse, more intentional, more ignorant. The mind began to fill in the person behind the words, their tone, their habits, their character. A whole person was built out of a few lines of text. The thumb began to move. Words appeared, then disappeared. A draft took shape. It was sharp but reasonable, firm but not insulting. The kind of response that could be defended if needed. The chest felt tight. The breath shallow. The body leaned slightly forward, as if already entering an argument. Then something else became noticeable. The room was amplifying the anger. Every thought bounced back louder than it arrived. The quiet made the words heavier. The isolation gave the mind too much space to echo itself. It felt like standing in a cave and shouting insults, only to have them return stronger, harsher, multiplied. That image landed. An echo chamber doesn't create sound. It just repeats it. The anger hadn't come from the room, but the room was giving it nowhere to go, except back. The thumb stopped moving. The draft stayed unsent. The phone was set down on the table. Face up this time. The light felt brighter than before. It became clear how easily the anger had been fed. A sentence had entered the mind, and the mind had decided to become its amplifier. What had been irritation was turning into identity. This is who I am. This is what I stand against. That's how anger recruits. It asks you to become its voice. The lamp buzzed faintly. The air conditioner clicked on. The ordinary sounds of the room reasserted themselves. The anger didn't disappear, but it paused. There was a realization then, uncomfortable but precise. Responding wouldn't stop the words from existing. It would only add another voice to the cavern. The mind resisted. Silence equals agreement. But silence doesn't always mean approval. Sometimes it means refusing to become a surface for reflection. The phone was picked up again. The draft was still there. Reread once. It sounded different now. Less strong, more performative. Like something written to be echoed, not heard. The words were deleted. Not because they weren't justified, but because repeating them would only keep them alive. The anger settled into something else. Not calm, not peace, just restraint. The room felt larger again, less charged. The echoes softened. The original comment still existed somewhere out there, unanswered, uncorrected. But it wasn't bouncing around in this room anymore. And for the first time since reading it, the anger wasn't multiplying. The phone stayed on the table longer than expected. Not out of discipline, out of a strange loss of interest. The anger that had felt sharp a few minutes ago now felt repetitive, like a sound that had already been heard too many times. The room was still quiet, but it no longer felt like a cave. The echoes had softened. Ordinary sounds returned to the foreground, the hum of the refrigerator, the faint traffic outside a neighbor's footsteps overhead. The mind tried again. It brought the comment back, framed a different response this time. Kinder, maybe, or more explanatory. Something that would add context, something reasonable. But the body reacted the same way. A subtle tightening, a familiar forward lean. The sense of entering a space where nothing ever really lands. That was the pattern. Any response, no matter the tone, pulled the mind back into the same chamber, the same loop, the same amplification. It became clear that the issue wasn't whether the response was right or wrong. It was what responding did to the one doing it. Anger wants an audience. If it can't find one, it'll make one inside your own head. Standing up, the body moved toward the window. The city lights were scattered uneven. Some windows lit, others dark. So many lives continuing completely untouched by the sentence that had felt so urgent earlier. The comment had already moved on, buried under newer posts, newer opinions, newer outrage. But inside this room, it had been given a microphone. That realization wasn't comforting. It was clarifying. The power of words isn't just in what they say. It's in how long we let them echo. There was a memory of past arguments years ago where sharp words had been exchanged. Each one justified. Each one returned with interest. No one had walked away feeling understood, only louder. Those moments hadn't failed because the points were wrong. They had failed because the space couldn't hold them without distortion. Echo chambers don't discriminate. They amplify kindness and cruelty alike. Whatever you throw in comes back, altered, stronger, less true. The phone was picked up again, not to respond, just to turn it off. The screen went dark. It felt quieter immediately, not peaceful, just less stimulated, less reactive. Anger doesn't disappear when ignored, but it does lose its momentum when it's not rehearsed. The thought arose. There's a difference between speaking and sounding off. Speaking aims to be heard. Sounding off aims to release pressure. Echo chambers reward the second and punish the first. That didn't mean silence forever. It didn't mean never naming harm. It just meant choosing the right spaces, the right moments, the right tone. Not every room needs to be used. The body returned to the chair. The lamp cast the same soft light as before. Nothing dramatic had changed, but something important had not happened. The anger hadn't been fed. It hadn't been given a surface to bounce off of. It hadn't multiplied. Instead, it had been contained. There was a subtle relief in that. Not the relief of being right. The relief of not being pulled. The comment would exist tomorrow, and the day after, and then disappear into the noise like everything else. What mattered more was the choice made tonight to not become a chamber for words that didn't deserve to live rent-free inside. The room felt neutral now, just a room again. The echo was gone, and that was enough. The spill happened fast. One small bump of the elbow, a light clink against the table, and then the sound water rushing where it wasn't meant to go. It wasn't a lot of water, just a bowl half full tipped over on the kitchen counter. It spread quickly, slipping toward the edge, dripping onto the floor in thin lines. The reaction came just as quickly. A sharp inhale, a flash of irritation, a sentence already forming in the mind. Of course this happens now. Not because of the water, because of everything else layered underneath it. The day had already been long, a disagreement earlier that hadn't really ended. A conversation that stopped too soon, a feeling that something important had been mishandled, left open. The spill became the symbol. Paper towels were grabbed. Water was wiped up fast, almost aggressively. The bowl was set back upright, empty now, innocent again. But the anger didn't go with the water. It stayed tight in the chest, looking for somewhere else to land. The mind jumped backward in time. To the argument. To the words that should have been said. To the apology that hadn't come. The bowl on the counter faded from importance, replaced by the image of that unfinished moment. Anger has a way of convincing us that if we replay the past hard enough, it will eventually change. The counter was wiped again, even though it was already dry. The towel moved back and forth faster than necessary. A thought surfaced loud and familiar. Why do I keep thinking about this? Another followed right after. Because it wasn't fair. That felt true. The unfairness sat heavy. It demanded attention. The bowl was moved to the sink. Water was turned on. The sound filled the space, steady and grounding. The hands moved under the stream, rinsing the bowl. There was nothing wrong with it. No crack, no damage, just empty. That's when the comparison arrived. Spilled water doesn't go back into the bowl, no matter how much you want it to, no matter how unfair the spill felt. The water is already gone. Standing there, hands wet, the mind resisted the idea immediately. This isn't the same thing. The argument wasn't water. The hurt wasn't accidental. Someone else had been involved. And yet, the feeling was similar. The wishing things had gone differently. The urge to rewind. The quiet insistence that if the moment could just be replayed, everything would settle. The water kept running. The bowl stayed empty. There was a memory of being told long ago, "Don't cry over spilled milk." It had always sounded dismissive, like a way to shut down real disappointment. But maybe it wasn't about dismissing the loss. Maybe it was about noticing where the attention was being placed. The water on the counter had been wiped up quickly, efficiently, without drama. Because there was something else to do: move forward, clean up, continue the evening. The emotional spill hadn't been treated the same way. It had been stared at, replayed, argued with internally. The mind had been kneeling on the floor, mourning a bowl that could never be refilled. The faucet was turned off. The bowl was set on the drying rack upside down. Empty bowls don't mean failure. They mean space. That thought didn't land comfortably. Space can feel like absence before it feels like possibility. The body leaned against the counter. A breath went out slower than expected. The argument returned again, softer this time. Not the words, but the feeling. The tightness. The disappointment. The sense of being misunderstood. It became clear that none of that would change by standing here replaying it. The water wouldn't return. The moment wouldn't rewrite itself. What could change was where attention went next. The towel was hung to dry. The floor was already clean. The bowl would be used again tomorrow. Nothing dramatic had been lost, but something had been learned quietly. Holding on to what spilled keeps your hands wet and your mind stuck. Letting it go doesn't mean pretending it didn't matter. It means accepting that it already happened. The bowl sat there, simple and empty, waiting to be filled again. Later that evening, the house settled into its quieter rhythm. The lights were dimmed. The sounds softened. The bowl sat where it had been left, clean, dry, turned upside down on the rack. It was still empty. That shouldn't have mattered. And yet the mind kept returning to it as if something unfinished were waiting there. The argument came back too. Not as sharply as before, but persistent. The mind offered new versions this time, slightly kinder words, slightly clearer explanations, a moment where everything landed the way it was supposed to. If I had said it differently, if I had waited, if I had just one more chance. Regret has a quiet voice, but it's relentless. It doesn't shout. It whispers the same sentence over and over until it sounds like truth. The body sat on the couch, but the mind stayed in the past, kneeling over that spilled moment, trying to scoop it back up with bare hands. There was a realization then, gentle but firm. Regret and care often get confused. Caring says, "This mattered." Regret says, "Stay here." One honors what was important. The other traps you in what can't be changed. The bowl hadn't been careless. It had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time. The spill hadn't meant anything about the future. It was just an event, a moment that passed. The argument was the same. It had happened. It had landed the way it landed. No amount of replay would make the water climb back into the bowl. That didn't mean the relationship was empty forever. It meant this particular moment was over. The kitchen was passed again on the way to get a blanket. The bowl caught the eye once more. It looked ordinary now, neutral, no longer charged with meaning. There was a thought, soft, almost practical: I can get another bowl. Not to replace what was lost, to continue. That was the difference. Letting go isn't the same as giving up. Giving up says, nothing else matters now. Letting go says, this moment is finished. Another one can begin. The mind resisted again briefly. But what if I'm letting them off too easily? That question carried the old tension. But letting go of spilled water doesn't excuse gravity. It just accepts it. Forgiveness doesn't mean denying harm. It means refusing to stay soaked by it. The blanket was pulled up. The body shifted, finding a more comfortable position. The breath slowed naturally without instruction. The argument faded further into the background. Still present, but no longer demanding center stage. Tomorrow there could be a conversation, or there might not. Either way, it didn't need to be decided tonight. Tonight was about drying off. The bowl would be filled again, maybe with soup, maybe with cereal, maybe with something entirely different. It would serve its purpose again because bowls are meant to be used, not mourned. The mind finally let go of the image of water spreading across the counter. The floor was dry. The towels were hung. The spill no longer existed anywhere except memory. And memory too can be set down, not erased. Just placed gently on a shelf where it doesn't need to be carried everywhere. The room grew quieter. The night moved forward. The bowl stayed empty for now. And that was okay. They got home later than they meant to. Not because the work was impossible, but because leaving felt like letting something go. The last email, the last check, the last glance at the calendar. The small invisible rituals that made them feel like they were still in control. When they finally stepped inside, the house was quiet. No music, no TV, just the soft sound of the HVAC running a low, steady breath in the walls. A porch light spilled in through the front window, thin and pale. They stood in the entryway for a moment without moving, still wearing their outside self. The jacket, the shoes, the posture. That posture had become automatic over the years. Shoulders back, face neutral, eyes alert. The kind of body language that says, I've got this. Even if underneath the body felt tired in places no one could see. They reached up and loosened the knot of their tie, then paused. Something about the motion made their chest tighten slightly, like removing it would mean admitting how much the day had taken out of them. So they left it on a little longer than necessary. In the hallway mirror, they caught their own reflection. The outfit still looked sharp. The hair was still in place. The expression was controlled, practiced, familiar. They had worked hard to build this version of themselves. Not in a vain way, in a survival way. A long time ago, they learned that being respected felt safer than being misunderstood. That looking capable often meant being left alone. That in certain rooms you had to arrive already armored. And over time, the armor got heavier. They stepped into the bedroom and opened the closet. The hangers were arranged neatly. Shirts grouped by color. Shoes lined up like a quiet parade. Everything in its place. Everything ready. They slipped the jacket off first. The fabric lifted away from their shoulders like a weight, leaving almost before they noticed it was there. They hung it carefully, smoothing the sleeve, adjusting the collar. It looked like nothing special on a hanger, just cloth. They unbuttoned the shirt, folded it once, then twice the way they always did. The motions were efficient, practiced. In the background, a ceiling fan turned slowly, its soft whir filling the room, like a gentle metronome. They sat on the edge of the bed and stared at their hands. Even without the jacket, they still felt the day on their skin. A meeting that didn't go well. A moment where someone challenged them. The way their voice had stayed steady while their stomach tightened. The way they'd smiled at the right times. It was strange how quickly a person could become a role. At work, they were the one who knows, the one who can handle it, the one who keeps it together. Those titles weren't official, but they lived in people's expectations. And those expectations had their own gravity. They reached for the tie again and finally pulled it loose. The fabric slid through their fingers, smooth and cool, then fell into their lap. For a second, they just held it there. It hit them then how much they depended on the costume. Not for others, for themselves. The clothes were proof. Proof that they mattered. Proof that they belonged. Proof that they weren't the younger version of themselves anymore. The one who had been overlooked, underestimated, talked over. They stood and walked back to the closet, tie still in hand, and hung it beside the jacket. Seeing it there, still quiet, made something inside them shift. If the jacket is just cloth, then what was the power they'd been carrying all day? Where did it actually live? They turned away from the closet and looked around the room. A lamp on the dresser, a water glass, a small stack of books they kept meaning to read. Ordinary objects, indifferent to job titles, indifferent to performance. The room didn't care who they were outside. The ceiling fan kept turning. The air moved gently across their skin, and for a moment they felt the simplest thing. They were still here, not as a role, not as a reputation, not as an image, just as a person in a quiet room with a tired body. They sat down again this time, letting their shoulders drop fully. The release felt almost unfamiliar, like taking off shoes you didn't realize were too tight until they're gone. A thought rose up, soft but clear. What if I'm allowed to be myself after the cloak comes off? It wasn't a question about quitting or escaping. They weren't imagining throwing everything away. They had built a life. They had responsibilities. They cared about doing well. But somewhere along the way, the doing had started to replace the being. And if they were honest, the being had been waiting patiently underneath all of it, like skin under a uniform. They stood and walked to the bathroom, turning on the faucet. Water ran cold for a second, then warmed. They washed their hands slowly, watching the way the water moved over their fingers, clear and simple. No performance, no outcome, just water doing what water does. They dried their hands and returned to the bedroom. On the hanger, the jacket stayed perfectly still. It didn't look impressive anymore. It just looked like something that could be taken off. And that felt like a kind of freedom. Later that night, the house grew even quieter. The sounds of the day had faded. No notifications, no conversations replaying themselves quite as loudly. just the low hum of the ceiling fan and the occasional creak as the house settled into itself. They lay back on the bed without turning off the light right away. One arm rested across their stomach, the other along the mattress. Their breathing slowed naturally, without effort, without instruction. Their eyes drifted to the closet again. The jacket hung there exactly as they had left it. Neat, proper, still holding the shape it had worn all day, as if waiting to be called back into service. The tie beside it caught the light, slightly smooth and polished. It struck them how small it all looked from here. Earlier, those things had carried weight, authority, expectation. Now, in the quiet, they looked almost fragile. Temporary. They thought about how easily the world confuses the symbols for the substance. Titles, clothing, access, attention. Those things can open doors. They can make life easier in certain ways. They can protect you in rooms where being seen as powerful matters. But they are not the power. They are the cloak. And cloaks by nature are meant to be worn and removed. The person lying there had worn many cloaks in their life. Student, new hire, expert, leader. Each one had taught them something. Each one had required a posture, a tone, a way of holding themselves. None of them had been false, but none of them had been the whole truth either. They shifted slightly on the bed, feeling the mattress give under their weight. The body underneath the rolls felt steady, solid, real in a way that didn't depend on being recognized. There was a quiet relief in that. They remembered moments when they had been afraid to take the cloak off, afraid that without it they would disappear, that people would stop listening, that they would lose whatever respect they had earned. But here alone in the room, nothing vanished. They were still breathing, still thinking, still present. The respect they needed most tonight wasn't coming from outside anyway. It was coming from the simple act of letting themselves rest. They reached over and turned off the lamp. The room softened instantly, edges fading into shadow. The fan continued its slow rotation, steady and indifferent. In the dark, it was easier to tell the difference between what was carried and who was carrying it. The cloak hadn't given them their voice. It hadn't given them their judgment. It hadn't given them their capacity to care, to decide, to endure. Those things had been there before the jacket ever was. They would be there tomorrow too. Tomorrow they would put the cloak on again. Step back into the world. Play the roles that help things function. There was nothing wrong with that. The cloak had its place. But it wasn't fused to them, and tonight at least they were allowed to set it down. That knowledge settled in gently, like a hand placed on the chest. They didn't need to strip their life down to nothing to be real. They didn't need to reject success to keep their soul. They didn't need to choose between being capable and being human. They could wear the cloak without mistaking it for their skin. As sleep crept closer, one last thought passed through, simple and unforced. Even without the crown, even without the room, even without the name on the door, they were still the one living this life, and that was enough. They noticed it first in their hands. Not the pain exactly, but the dryness. the fine cracks near the knuckles, the way the skin felt tight when they closed their fingers like it had been stretched too far and left there. It was late. The bathroom light was dimmed to its softest setting, the kind meant for nighttime. The rest of the house was quiet. No voices, no movement. Just the faint sound of water moving through the pipes somewhere behind the walls. They turned on the faucet and let the water run warm, holding their hands underneath it longer than necessary. The heat felt good, grounding. When they turned the water off, the silence returned slowly, like the room was exhaling. On the counter sat a small bottle of lotion. Nothing special. No brand they were loyal to. Just something they'd picked up once because their hands hurt and it was there. They pressed the pump and watched the lotion pool in their palm. For a moment they didn't move. All day they had been using these hands for other people. Typing messages meant to reassure, holding space for stories that weren't theirs, offering advice they hoped would help, even when they weren't sure it would. They were good at it. People said so often enough. "You're so supportive. You always know what to say. I don't know what I'd do without you." Those words had once felt like praise. Lately, they felt more like a responsibility. They rubbed their hands together slowly, spreading the lotion over their skin. The scent was light, almost unnoticeable. The motion was familiar, automatic. Something they'd done countless times without thinking. But tonight they noticed how careful they were being, how gentle. They moved the lotion into each finger, massaging the base of the thumb, the place that always ached first. The skin drank it in quickly, like it had been waiting. A thought passed through them, quiet and uncomfortable. When was the last time I treated myself this way? They had spent years learning how to respond to other people's pain, how to stay calm when emotions ran high, how to listen without interrupting, how to say the right thing without making it about themselves. Somewhere along the way, they had started doing the same thing to their own hurt, listening just enough to acknowledge it, then setting it aside, then moving on. They told themselves they were being strong, being practical, being generous. But standing there now, hands slick with lotion, they could feel the cost of that habit. The mirror reflected them back, tired eyes, a face that still knew how to look composed, even when the inside felt thin. They met their own gaze briefly, then looked away, focusing instead on the simple task in front of them. They reached for a towel and dried their hands slowly. The cracks didn't sting as much anymore. The skin felt softer, more flexible. Not healed, but helped. They leaned back against the counter and let their shoulders drop. The release was small, but noticeable. Like setting down a bag they hadn't realized was digging into their arm. Throughout the day, they had been the one who listened, the one who checked in, the one who stayed steady when others couldn't. It felt good to be needed. It gave them a sense of purpose, of worth. But it also made it very easy to forget that need goes both ways. They picked up the lotion bottle again and turned it over in their hands. The label was smudged, the cap slightly crooked. It had been tossed into bags, dropped once or twice, used whenever someone else needed it. They realized then that they had been waiting for someone else to notice the cracks, waiting for someone else to offer care, waiting for someone else to say, "Hey, you don't have to hold everything alone." But tonight, no one was here to do that. And strangely, that didn't feel as lonely as it used to. They placed the bottle back on the counter and rested their palms flat against the cool surface. The contrast between the cold stone and their warmed skin made them pause. There was a quiet truth sitting just beneath the surface of the moment. Healing doesn't always come from being helped. Sometimes it comes from helping yourself in the exact way you've been offering to everyone else. They stayed there a little longer, breathing evenly, letting the idea settle without trying to shape it into a rule or a promise. The hands felt better now. Not perfect, but acknowledged. And for the first time that evening, that felt like enough. They turned off the bathroom light and let the room fall into shadow, leaving only the small nightlight glowing near the floor. The house felt different now, quieter, but not empty. More like it was holding space. They walked down the hallway slowly, noticing the way the floor felt cool under their feet. The sensation grounded them in their body in this moment instead of pulling them back into the day. In the bedroom, they sat on the edge of the bed and rested their hands in their lap. The skin felt softer now, more comfortable. The tightness had eased. It wasn't just the lotion. It was the attention. They thought about how often they had rushed past their own signals. The heaviness in the chest, the shallow breath, the way their jaw clenched when they said yes one too many times. Those signs had been there all along, quietly asking to be noticed. But noticing felt dangerous once. If they stopped to feel, would everything fall apart? If they admitted they were tired, would they still be useful? If they asked for help, would anyone show up? Those questions had shaped their habits more than they realized, so they became the one who didn't need much, the one who could handle it, the one who healed others. That role brought connection, appreciation, a sense of being indispensable. It also brought isolation, because the healer, they learned, often forgets how to receive. Lying back on the bed, they stared at the ceiling as the fan turned slowly above them. Each rotation was unhurried, consistent, unconcerned with outcome. The rhythm was calming in a way that didn't ask anything in return. They placed one hand over their chest. The gesture felt awkward at first, self-conscious, like they were pretending. But they kept it there, feeling the rise and fall beneath their palm, feeling the simple fact of being alive without needing to justify it. They had offered this kind of presence to others countless times, sitting quietly while someone cried, staying with them in uncertainty, not fixing, not rushing. What would it be like to offer that same patience inward? They didn't answer the question. They didn't need to. They just stayed. The ache in their chest softened slightly, not because it was solved, but because it was finally being held. There was a quiet relief in realizing that healing didn't have to arrive as a breakthrough. It could arrive as a habit, as a series of small private acts of care that no one else ever sees. a glass of water when the body is dry, a pause before saying yes, a hand on the chest instead of another explanation. These weren't grand solutions. They didn't make good stories. They didn't earn praise. But they worked. The person they had been waiting for all along, the one who would notice, who would respond, who would tend the wound with gentleness, had been here the whole time. Not as a rescuer, not as a hero, just as themselves. The room stayed quiet. The night deepened. Tomorrow they would likely slip back into familiar patterns. They would listen, support, care. That part of them wasn't wrong or broken. But tonight something had shifted. They no longer believed that their worth came from being the one who held everything together. They no longer believed that neglecting themselves was the price of being needed. They were allowed to be both compassionate and cared for. As sleep approached, their breathing grew slower, deeper. The hand on their chest stayed there, warm and steady. The healer didn't disappear. They just learned how to turn the care inward, one small moment at a time. They didn't remember when it started, not the moment exactly. Just the feeling of slowly adjusting themselves to fit. Lowering their voice in certain rooms, choosing words carefully, smiling at the right time, holding opinions loosely even when they felt strong inside. It wasn't a lie, it was adaptation. And for a long time, it felt like maturity. That evening, they were walking through their neighborhood as the light faded. Street lamps flickered on, one by one, casting soft pools of yellow on the sidewalk. Leaves crunched underfoot. Somewhere nearby, a dog barked once, then went quiet again. They walked without headphones, hands tucked into their jacket pockets, letting the night sound be enough. The day had been full of small compromises. Nothing dramatic, no conflict worth naming. Just moments where they felt themselves hesitate before speaking, where they checked the room before responding, where they adjusted not because they were afraid, but because it felt easier. Easier to be agreeable, easier to be flexible, easier to be liked. By the time they got home, they often felt strangely tired, even on days when they hadn't done much. The exhaustion didn't come from effort. It came from restraint, from holding parts of themselves back without noticing. As they walked, they passed a small park tucked between two streets. The lights were dimmer there, shadows stretching across the grass. A bird stirred in a tree, wings fluttering briefly before settling again. The sound caught their attention. It was soft, quick, instinctive. They stopped for a moment and looked up, though they couldn't see much through the branches. Just movement. Just the sense of something alive and alert responding to the night without hesitation. It made something tighten in their chest. They remembered a time when they moved like that. Not recklessly, just honestly. When choices came from a clear internal yes or no instead of a calculation. Somewhere along the way, they had learned to check themselves first. Will this make things awkward? Is this too much? Should I hold back a little? Those questions had become second nature. Protective, sensible, but also heavy. They resumed walking, steps slow and even. The rhythm of their movement matched their breathing, steady and calm. The street ahead curved, slightly disappearing behind a row of houses. They thought about how often freedom is misunderstood. People imagine it as escape, as leaving everything behind, as doing whatever you want without consequence. That kind of freedom had never appealed to them. What they missed was quieter. The freedom to respond without rehearsing. The freedom to say no without guilt. The freedom to say yes without explaining. The freedom to be aligned. They reached a corner where the sidewalk widened. A bench sat under a tree empty. They paused there, resting one foot on the curb, feeling the cool air move across their face. The truth was, they weren't trapped by anyone else. No one had asked them to disappear. No one had demanded they shrink. They had done it themselves, slowly, out of habit. Out of a desire to keep things smooth. Out of care. Care can be a beautiful thing. But when it's not balanced, it can turn into a cage. They leaned against the tree and closed their eyes briefly. The bark was rough against their shoulder, solid, real. A thought surfaced not as a challenge, but as a gentle curiosity. What if being myself is enough, even when it's inconvenient? The idea didn't feel rebellious. It felt relieving. They opened their eyes and noticed how quiet the park was now. The bird had gone still again. The street lamps hummed faintly. The night didn't demand performance. They took a deeper breath than before, chest expanding fully, then let it go without controlling the exhale. The body responded immediately, shoulders lowering just a fraction. It wasn't freedom as a grand declaration. It was freedom as a release. They pushed off the tree and continued walking, posture a little looser. Now steps a little less careful. Nothing visible had changed. Anyone watching would see the same person walking home. But inside, something had stretched its wings, not to fly away, just to breathe. They didn't suddenly change who they were. They didn't start speaking louder or saying everything that came to mind. They didn't make bold declarations or redraw the shape of their life overnight. What changed was smaller than that. As they walked the rest of the way home, they noticed how often they'd been holding their breath without realizing it. In conversations, in decisions, in moments where they waited for permission that never actually came. They let their breath move freely now, in and out, matching the pace of their steps. The body responded right away, as if it had been waiting for that signal. At the next intersection, a car passed slowly, headlights sweeping across the sidewalk. For a second, their shadow stretched long in front of them, then fell back into place behind. The image lingered. They had spent so much time trying to stay within certain outlines, certain expectations, certain versions of who they should be, depending on the room they were in. But shadows change with the light. They don't mean something is wrong. They just mean you're still here. They reached their front door and paused before going inside. The house was dark, quiet, familiar. A place where they didn't need to perform, or at least where they were learning not to. Inside, they set their keys down and leaned against the counter, feeling the cool surface under their palms. The day loosened its hold a little more. They thought about how often they'd mistaken safety for freedom, Safety had meant staying agreeable, staying predictable, staying small enough not to disrupt the balance. It had worked in a way. It had kept things smooth. But it had also kept them separate from themselves. Freedom, they were realizing, wasn't about pushing against anyone. It wasn't about rejecting connection or choosing solitude over belonging. It was about alignment. About letting the inside and the outside match, even when that felt slightly uncomfortable. Even when it meant allowing a pause instead of filling the space. Allowing a no instead of another yes. They sat down on the couch and rested their head back, eyes closing for a moment. The quiet wrapped around them, the hum of the refrigerator, the distant sound of a neighbor's TV through the wall. Ordinary sounds, ordinary life. They placed a hand on their chest and felt the steady beat beneath it. That rhythm hadn't changed based on anyone else's approval. It hadn't sped up to impress. It hadn't slowed down to fit in. It just kept going. There was a kind of happiness in that realization. Not the bright celebratory kind, but the steady kind. The kind that comes from no longer fighting yourself. They didn't need to be everyone's version of easy. They didn't need to be endlessly adaptable. They didn't need to earn the right to take up space. Being themselves didn't mean being rigid or selfish. It meant being honest, responsive, alive in their own skin. Tomorrow there would be moments when they slipped back into old habits, when they softened their edges out of reflex, when they forgot. That didn't mean the wings were gone. It just meant they were still learning how to use them. They lay back and let the night settle, fully breathing slow and even. Somewhere outside, something moved in the dark, unseen, unjudged, simply following its nature. They didn't need to fly away to be free. They only needed to stop folding themselves smaller than they were. And in that quiet decision made again and again in small moments, happiness found room to land. The park was almost empty. Just a narrow path, a few benches, and a small stream running quietly alongside the trees. It wasn't the kind of place people posted about. No wide views, no dramatic scenery, just water moving over stones, steady and unremarkable. They stopped near the edge of the stream and stood there with their hands in their pockets. The air was cool, not cold. The kind that makes you aware of your breathing without asking you to change it. Earlier that day, they'd felt small. Not in a dramatic way. No one had said anything cruel. No big mistake had happened. It was more subtle than that. A conversation where someone talked about their plans with confidence. A comparison they hadn't meant to make. A quiet sense of falling behind without knowing exactly where. I'm not doing enough. I should be further along. This feels insignificant. The thoughts had followed them all afternoon, light but persistent like background noise. They watched the water move. It didn't rush. It didn't hesitate. It didn't try to widen itself into something more impressive. It just flowed, finding its way around rocks, slipping through narrow spaces, pooling briefly before continuing on. The sound was soft, A constant gentle rush broken occasionally by a splash when the water met a stone at the wrong angle. Nothing about it demanded attention, and yet it didn't stop. They leaned forward, slightly resting their hands on their knees, watching how the stream curved. In some places, it narrowed to almost nothing. In others, it spread out just enough to catch the light. They had always admired rivers, the way they carved paths through landscapes, the way they arrived at the ocean eventually, no matter how long it took. This wasn't that. This was just a small stream, and for a long time they had believed that small meant incomplete, that unless you were making a visible impact, unless your progress was obvious and measurable, you weren't really moving at all. That growth had to look like expansion, like speed, like recognition. Standing here, though, that belief felt less solid. The stream wasn't pretending to be a river. It wasn't apologizing for its size. It wasn't waiting for permission to continue. It moved because movement was what it did. They picked up a small pebble and rolled it between their fingers, smooth, worn down by time and water. The kind of stone you don't notice unless you're looking closely. How long had it taken to get this smooth? Not days, not weeks, years, maybe longer. The stream hadn't rushed it, hadn't forced it. It had just kept showing up day after day, doing the same quiet work. They thought about their own path, the slow progress, the starts that didn't lead anywhere obvious, the steady effort that never seemed to add up to something impressive. They had spent so much energy wishing they were a river wide, fast, undeniable, that they hadn't noticed they were already moving. They dropped the pebble back into the water and watched it disappear, swallowed instantly by the current. The stream didn't change course. It didn't react. It just carried on. A thought surfaced, simple and unexpected. What if getting there doesn't require being big? The idea didn't come with relief right away. It felt almost disappointing at first, like lowering expectations, like admitting defeat. But as they stayed with it, the thought softened. Maybe arriving isn't about scale. Maybe it's about continuity. The stream didn't know where the ocean was. It wasn't aiming for anything. It wasn't measuring distance or tracking milestones. It was just moving in the only way it could. They straightened up and took a slow breath. The sound of the water filled the space around them, steady and reliable. They realized how often they'd been waiting to feel ready before allowing themselves to count their efforts, waiting for proof that what they were doing mattered, waiting for someone to confirm that this pace was acceptable. But the stream didn't wait. It trusted the shape of the land. It trusted gravity. It trusted time. And somehow, that was enough. The sky above the trees had begun to dim, the light shifting toward evening. Shadows stretched across the path. The park grew quieter still. They stood there a few minutes longer, letting the sound of the water settle into them. They didn't suddenly feel successful. They didn't feel accomplished. But they felt less rushed, less tempted to dismiss what was already happening. They turned away from the stream and started back down the path, steps slow and even. The sound of the water followed them for a while, then faded as the trees thickened. Still, The rhythm stayed, a reminder that movement doesn't have to be loud to be real. They kept walking, but more slowly now. The path curved away from the stream, and the sound of water softened with each step. At first, it was still clear, a steady presence just behind them. Then it became distant, then barely noticeable, and finally it blended into the rest of the evening. They were surprised by how much they missed it. Not because it was beautiful or impressive, but because it had been constant, reliable. It hadn't tried to hold their attention. It had simply been there doing its quiet work. They thought about how often they judged their own life by volume. How loud is this success? How visible is this progress? How many people can see what I'm doing? Anything quieter than that felt easy to dismiss. They reached a bench near the edge of the path and sat down, resting their elbows on their knees. The wood was cool and slightly rough under their hands. Somewhere above them, branches shifted as the wind moved through leaves, brushing against one another in a soft, uneven rhythm. The truth was, they had been moving all along, even on the days that felt stagnant, even in the seasons that felt repetitive, even when no one noticed. They had learned things, shed habits, changed direction in small, almost invisible ways. The kind that didn't make good announcements, but made a real difference over time. Like water shaping stone without asking permission. They remembered moments they used to label as wasted. Jobs that didn't lead anywhere obvious. Relationships that ended quietly. Periods where nothing seemed to change at all. Looking back now, those moments felt different. They weren't dead ends. They were bends in the path. Places where the current slowed, widened, learned how to move around something instead of through it. They realized how much pressure they'd been carrying to become something bigger, faster, more defined. As if worth increased with size, as if being noticeable was the same as being meaningful. But the stream hadn't needed to announce itself to matter. It didn't need to be named on a map. It didn't need an audience. It didn't need to know where it was going next. It just kept going. They rested their hands on their thighs and let their shoulders relax. The body followed the thought naturally, like it recognized something true. There was a deep comfort in letting go of the idea that they had to become more than they were. What if becoming wasn't about expansion, but about continuation, about showing up again tomorrow, and the day after that, about letting effort compound quietly instead of demanding immediate results? They sat there for a while longer, watching the light fade through the trees. The park felt held in a kind of in-between state, not fully day, not fully night. The air cooled just enough to be refreshing. Eventually, they stood and brushed their hands together, leaving faint traces of dust behind. They didn't feel inspired in the dramatic sense. They didn't feel driven. They felt steady. As they walked back toward the exit, the idea stayed with them. They didn't need to widen themselves to justify their existence. They didn't need to rush to prove they were going somewhere. They didn't need to compare their pace to anyone else's current. The stream would reach the ocean one day. Not because it tried harder, not because it grew larger, but because it never stopped moving. And that they realized was something they could trust too. They stepped out of the park and back onto the street, the sounds of the neighborhood returning slowly. Cars in the distance, a door closing somewhere, ordinary life continuing. Inside them, the rhythm remained. Quiet, persistent, enough. The train was already moving when the person realized how tired they were. Not the kind of tired that shows up all at once, dramatic and obvious. This was quieter. A slow heaviness behind the eyes. A weight in the shoulders that didn't belong to the bag they were carrying. The kind of tired that comes from staying alert for too long, from watching the road, even when you're not the one driving. The seat was warm from the day. The window beside it showed reflections more than scenery flickers of light. The ghost of a face layered over the darkening evening. The hum of the train settled into a steady rhythm, neither fast nor slow. Just consistent, predictable. That predictability should have been comforting. Instead, the mind stayed awake. It ran through lists, things that hadn't been finished, things that might be missed, things that could still go wrong. Tomorrow's responsibilities lined up neatly, each one tapping on the inside of the skull like it was important to be seen first. The body leaned back anyway. Muscles gave up their tension in small stages like they were negotiating a ceasefire. The head rested against the window. Cool glass met warm skin. The contrast felt grounding, even pleasant. The thought came uninvited but familiar. You shouldn't fall asleep. Not because there was danger, not because anything bad was about to happen. Just the old belief that staying awake was somehow useful. That vigilance equaled responsibility. That if you stopped paying attention, you might miss the moment you needed to act. The train rocked gently as it picked up speed. The sound of the rails was even almost lulling. Around the car, other passengers were doing ordinary things. One person scrolled on a phone. Another stared forward, eyes unfocused. Someone else had already let their head fall to the side, mouth slightly open, fully surrendered to sleep. The sight stirred something complicated. A mix of envy and concern. How can they sleep? Don't they know anything could happen? The mind offered these questions as if they were practical, as if worry were a form of care. The body, however, had different priorities. The eyelids felt heavier now. Blinking took effort. The breath slowed without instruction. A yawn stretched the jaw wide, pulling tension loose from places that hadn't realized they were tight. The train kept going. That was the strange part. Nothing changed when the person yawned. The lights didn't flicker. The tracks didn't bend. The train didn't ask for permission or approval. It moved forward with or without anyone's attention. There was a memory then from years ago of being a child on a long car ride, sitting in the back seat, watching streetlights pass like quiet stars. Fighting sleep because it felt important to stay awake to witness the whole journey. And then waking up later, surprised to find the car still moving closer to the destination than expected. Nothing bad had happened in that gap. Life had carried on. The present moment felt like that memory layered over itself. The adult version of the same pattern. The same belief that being awake equaled being in control. That consciousness itself was the thing keeping everything on track. The train slowed slightly as it passed through a darker stretch. The hum dropped an octave. The rhythm stayed steady. The body responded immediately, shoulders sinking further into the seat. Another thought surfaced softer than the others. What if it's okay to rest? The mind resisted. It listed reasons. What if you miss your stop? What if something goes wrong? What if you regret letting go? All reasonable questions, all unanswered. But underneath them was a simpler truth. The train didn't rely on the passenger's worry to reach its destination. The tracks were laid. The direction was set. The system was already in motion. The person noticed their hands resting in their lap, fingers unclenched, palms open. The body had chosen its position without asking for permission. It had made a quiet decision on its own. The head tipped slightly to one side. The window hummed faintly with motion. The eyes closed for a second, then opened again, startled by the unfamiliar softness of that brief darkness. Don't fall asleep yet, the mind urged. Stay alert. But alert for what? The answer didn't come. The question hung there unresolved. The person let the eyes close again, this time for a fraction longer. The train rocked. The rails sang their steady song. The world continued its forward movement, unconcerned with whether one passenger was awake to witness it. There was no dramatic release, no deep surrender, just a gradual easing, like loosening a grip that had been held too long without realizing it. If sleep came, it would come. If it didn't, that would be fine too. Either way, the train would keep moving, and for the first time in a while, the person felt the possibility that maybe they didn't have to carry the journey on their shoulders. The eyes opened again slowly, as if surfacing from shallow water. It was hard to tell how much time had passed. Maybe a few minutes, maybe less. The train was still moving the same gentle rhythm underneath, everything steady and unbothered. Nothing had changed. That realization landed softly, not with surprise, but with relief. The lights inside the car glowed the same pale yellow. The reflections in the window still layered the dark outside with the faint outline of faces and seats. The person across the aisle was still asleep, head tipped back, breathing slow and even. Another passenger shifted in their seat and then settled again. Life had not paused. Life had not needed supervision. The mind tried one more time to reclaim control. It offered a final checklist. Stay aware, count the stops, don't lose track. These thoughts had the tone of responsibility, but they carried the weight of habit more than necessity. Underneath them, something else stirred. A quiet trust. Not the dramatic kind that comes with certainty or optimism. This was smaller, quieter. The trust that systems can function without constant monitoring. That momentum doesn't require tension. That rest doesn't equal failure. The body leaned more fully into the seat now. The spine curved naturally. The shoulders no longer hovered waiting. The breath settled into a slow, even pattern, rising and falling without effort. It was easier to notice the sound of the train this way. Not just noise, but texture. The soft clack of rails, the low hum of the engine, the subtle sway that rocked the car side to side. It felt almost like being carried. There was a strange tenderness in that realization. So much of life had been spent trying to drive, trying to steer, trying to stay awake at the wheel even when it wasn't necessary, as if vigilance were the price of safety. But here on this train, that belief didn't hold up. The person thought of all the times they'd lain awake at night rehearsing futures that never arrived, worrying through conversations that never happened, staying mentally alert long past the point where it made any difference. None of that had changed the tracks. The train slowed as it approached a station. The sound shifted. Brakes hissed softly. A few people stood up gathering their things. The doors opened with a familiar chime, letting in a rush of cooler air and distant city noise. The person opened their eyes fully now, more awake than before, but not tense. Watching without gripping, observing without managing. Some passengers stepped off, others stepped on. The doors closed again. The train resumed its movement. Still no catastrophe. Still no missed signal that mattered. The person realized something then, not as a thought, but as a felt sense. Waking and sleeping weren't opposites in the way they'd been treated. One wasn't responsible and the other careless. They were just different states of being carried. Even if sleep had come fully, the train would have kept going. Even if the mind had let go completely, the destination would still exist. This didn't mean attention was useless. It didn't mean responsibility disappeared. It meant that attention didn't need to be strained to be effective. That awareness could be soft and still work. The head leaned back again. The window vibrated gently against the skull. The sensation was oddly comforting, like white noise made physical. The eyelids lowered this time without resistance. There was no dramatic decision, no internal speech about allowing or choosing. The body simply followed the rhythm it had been hearing all along. The train continued through the night lights, passing stations appearing and fading. The world moved at its own pace, reliable in ways that didn't require constant thought. And somewhere between one stop and the next, the person understood something simple and freeing. Worry wasn't keeping the train on the tracks. Being awake wasn't what made the journey safe. The journey was already happening, with or without vigilance, with or without effort. The body rested into that truth, however briefly. And in that resting, something else became possible, a kind of peace that didn't need to be held together because it wasn't fragile in the first place. The train rolled on, and the passenger finally didn't feel the need to stay awake just to make sure it did. The light came in at an angle. Late afternoon light, the kind that doesn't try to brighten the whole room, just slips in quietly through the gap in the curtains. It landed on the wooden floor, then climbed the wall, slow and patient. In that narrow beam, tiny specks floated, dust barely visible until the light found them. They moved constantly, drifting, spinning, rising and falling for no clear reason. The person noticed them while standing still in the living room, halfway between tasks. There had been an intention to clean, or maybe to sit down, or maybe to do nothing for a minute before deciding what came next. The body hadn't chosen yet, so it paused. The dust kept moving. At first there was a familiar tightening in the chest, a reflex. The place is dusty. I should clean. This means I've let things slide. The thoughts came quickly dressed up as responsibility, as if the dust were a problem that said something about who the person was. The eyes followed the particles for a moment longer. They were too small to catch, too many to count. Even if the room were scrubbed spotless, more would appear tomorrow, or later that same day. Dust wasn't a sign of failure. It was a sign of life moving through a space. Air carried things. Light revealed them. That realization didn't arrive as a sentence. It arrived as a loosening. The body leaned against the back of the couch. The fabric felt warm where the sun had touched it. The room was quiet, except for the faint hum of the air conditioner, turning on and off, regulating temperature without being asked. The mind, however, stayed busy. It always did. It jumped from the dust to something else, as it usually did. A conversation from earlier, a message left unanswered, a worry about whether the future would line up the way it was supposed to. Each thought appeared clearly for a second, sharp and defined, then drifted into the next. They looked a lot like the dust, small, numerous, always moving. And yet somehow the mind treated them differently. Dust in sunlight was harmless, even a little beautiful. Thoughts, on the other hand, were treated like evidence, like proof that something was wrong, unfinished, or in danger of falling apart. The person noticed that difference without judging it, just noticing. The way you might notice you always tense your shoulders when a certain song comes on. There was a thought now about work. It hovered near the front of awareness, demanding attention. A decision that hadn't been made. A scenario that hadn't been resolved. The familiar urge to follow it rose immediately. Think this through. Figure it out now. Don't let it float away. The urge felt responsible, necessary. But the sunlight didn't care which dust particle mattered more. It illuminated all of them equally, without preference or reaction. The light stayed clean, unstained. That was the part that stopped the person. The dust didn't dirty the light. No matter how many particles passed through it, the beam stayed bright, clear, unchanged. It didn't resist the dust. It didn't try to filter it out. It didn't tighten or bend in response. It simply shone. The thought about work drifted closer, louder now. It wanted engagement. It wanted analysis. It wanted reassurance. The person felt the familiar pull to grab onto it, to start scratching at it the way the mind often did. Instead, the person stayed still, not rigid, just still enough to watch. The thought moved the way the dust did. It shifted shape. It changed direction. Another thought bumped into it and sent it spinning somewhere else. A third thought followed behind it, less intense, more vague. None of them stayed for long. The body exhaled slowly, not as a technique, just as a response to seeing something clearly. The chest softened. The shoulders dropped a fraction. The jaw unclenched. For a moment, there was a strange quiet. Not the absence of thought, but the absence of urgency around thought. The mind was still active, but it wasn't grabbing at everything that passed by. It was just noticing. The person realized then how often they'd been trying to keep the mind clean, clear, empty, as if peace depended on eliminating every stray thought, every worry, every mental particle that floated through awareness. No wonder it felt exhausting. Trying to stop dust from existing would mean stopping air from moving. Trying to stop thoughts from appearing would mean stopping the mind from being alive. The sunlight shifted slightly as a cloud passed overhead. The dust became harder to see, then visible again when the light returned. The room stayed the same either way. The thoughts did the same. Some moments were quieter, some were more crowded. But the space that held them, the awareness watching, didn't need to change in response. That awareness felt closer now, more familiar. Not something to reach for, but something already present. Like the light, it didn't belong to the dust. It wasn't made dirty by what passed through it. The person stood there longer than expected, doing nothing that looked productive. No cleaning, no planning, no fixing. Just standing in the late afternoon, watching dust float in a beam of light. And for the first time that day, the mind didn't feel like a problem that needed solving. It felt like movement. Natural, temporary, unthreatening. The light remained. The cloud passed and the sunlight grew stronger again. The beam sharpened, brightening the space near the wall. The dust returned to visibility, swirling in its quiet, endless dance. Nothing had changed, and yet it felt new, like noticing a familiar room with different eyes. The person shifted their weight, feet pressing into the floor. The simple sensation grounded the body, pulling attention away from the mind's usual tight loops. The floor was solid, reliable. It didn't comment on anything, it just held. The thoughts were still there. More came in as soon as space allowed them to. A worry about money. A memory from years ago. A small irritation about something left undone. Each one drifted into awareness, paused briefly, then slid away when it wasn't fed. This was unfamiliar. Normally, one thought would hook the mind and drag it into a spiral. Analysis would pile on top of analysis. Meaning would be assigned. Stories would grow teeth. But now, the thoughts felt lighter. Not because they were kinder or smarter, but because they weren't being treated as instructions. They were being treated as dust. The person noticed the urge to evaluate this experience. Is this mindfulness? Is this working? Will it last? Even that urge appeared like another speck in the light. Brief, almost playful in its predictability. It drifted away too. There was a subtle warmth spreading through the chest, not excitement, not happiness, just ease. The nervous system, sensing no immediate threat, began to settle on its own. Muscles softened. Breathing slowed. Peace, it turned out, wasn't the absence of mental noise. It was the absence of resistance to it. The person remembered how often they had judged themselves for thinking too much, for being distracted, for not being calm enough. Each judgment had been another attempt to scrub the mind clean, another layer of effort added to an already busy system. Seeing thoughts as dust changed that. Dust wasn't a personal failure. It wasn't a flaw in the room. It was a byproduct of living in a space where air moved and light existed. The presence of dust didn't mean the sunlight was broken. The same was true here. The awareness watching the thoughts wasn't damaged by them. It wasn't crowded or stained. It remained open, clear, available. The air conditioner clicked off, leaving the room in deeper quiet. The silence wasn't empty. It was full of subtle sounds, the house settling, distant traffic, the faint buzz of electricity behind the walls. All of it happened without commentary. The mind noticed it, but didn't label it as good or bad. The person sat down on the couch, now drawn there without much thought. The cushions yielded gently. The body adjusted, finding comfort without instruction. The light shifted again as the sun lowered the beam, climbing higher on the wall, then thinning. Soon the dust would disappear from view. Not because it was gone, but because the light had moved on. That felt important. Thoughts didn't need to be removed to stop dominating attention. Sometimes all that was needed was a shift in perspective, a different angle, a willingness to let awareness rest somewhere else. The worries about the future hadn't been resolved. The past hadn't been rewritten. Life hadn't become suddenly clear or easy. But the relationship to those thoughts had changed. They were no longer treated as truths demanding obedience. They were events passing through awareness, no more threatening than dust in a sunbeam. The person rested there as the light faded, the room growing softer, dimmer. The dust disappeared from sight. The thoughts, too, seemed to thin, not because they'd been pushed away, but because they weren't being fed. There was a quiet gratitude in that moment, though it wasn't directed at anything in particular. Just an appreciation for the simplicity of not having to fix the mind in order to be at ease. The day moved toward evening. Shadows stretched. The light shifted fully out of the room. The dust was still there. The thoughts were still there. And yet, the space felt clean. Not because it had been emptied, but because it had been allowed to be what it was. The person closed their eyes for a moment, breathing easily, carried by the ordinary sounds of the house and the quiet understanding that peace didn't require control. It only required seeing clearly and letting the light do the rest. The book was thicker than expected. Not heavy in a dramatic way, just solid. The kind of book that promises a lot simply by existing. It sat on the desk with a clean cover, crisp pages, and a title that hinted at answers. Answers about how things unfold, how people find their way, how stories eventually make sense. The person picked it up, flipped a few pages, then closed it again. There was a familiar feeling in the chest. A quiet pressure. Not excitement, not dread. Something in between. The feeling that comes when you stand at the beginning of something and immediately start worrying about the end. The desk lamp cast a soft circle of light. Outside, the day was winding down, but inside, the room felt suspended, like time had slowed just enough to notice what was usually skipped over. The chair creaked slightly as the person leaned back, fingers resting on the edge of the book. The mind had already jumped ahead. Will this be worth it? What if I don't understand it? What if I start and never finish? What if the ending disappoints me? The questions came fast, stacking on top of each other before the first page had even been read. It was as if the mind needed to know the entire arc before allowing the story to begin. This wasn't really about the book. It was about the way the mind treated beginnings. Every new job, every new relationship, every small shift or decision. The same pattern appeared standing at chapter 1, while mentally sprinting toward the final pages, measuring worth before experience, judging outcomes before taking the first step. The person noticed how the body responded to that pattern. Shoulders subtly tensed, breath shortened. The hands held the book more tightly than necessary, as if gripping it might somehow guarantee a good ending. The pages stayed quiet. Books are patient that way. They don't rush you. They don't explain themselves in advance. They simply wait to be read one page at a time. The person opened the book again, this time slower. The first page was simple. No grand reveal. Just an opening line, unassuming, almost ordinary. It didn't try to hook or impress. It just began. The mind reacted immediately. This is slow. Is this going anywhere? Maybe this isn't the right book. The urge to skip ahead was strong, to flip to the middle, to peek at the last chapter, to see where all this was headed before investing any attention. The person's thumb slid to the edge of the pages, ready to fan them forward. And then it stopped. Not because of discipline, not because of resolve, just because something felt tired. Tired of always jumping ahead, tired of treating the present moment like a waiting room for something better. The thumb relaxed. The pages stayed where they were. There was a realization, quiet and unforced worrying about the ending didn't actually prepare you for it. It only pulled you away from where you were now. The body settled back into the chair. The lamp hummed faintly. The room held its stillness. The first page was read again, more slowly this time. The words landed differently when they weren't being rushed. Details emerged. Small textures, a tone, a rhythm. Nothing dramatic, but something steady. The mind still wandered. It thought about tomorrow, about whether this book would end up half-finished on a shelf like so many others, about whether starting was a mistake. Those thoughts were noticed, but not chased. They hovered, then drifted like background noise. The person turned the page. There was no surge of confidence, no sudden certainty that this was the right choice. Just a small action completed. One page read, one page turned. It felt strangely satisfying, not because of achievement, but because of presence. The book hadn't asked for commitment to the ending. It hadn't demanded promises about finishing. It only asked for attention right now. The person read a few more lines, then a few more. Time passed without being tracked. The desk lamp grew warmer as the room darkened slightly. The mind still tried to jump ahead now and then. It offered worries dressed as practical concerns. But each time the eyes returned to the page in front of them. This was new. Not perfect, not permanent, but new. For once, the future wasn't in charge of the present. The person closed the book again after a while, not because it was finished, but because that was enough for tonight. The cover felt familiar now, less intimidating. The thickness no longer felt like a challenge. It felt like possibility. The book was set gently back on the desk. The ending was still unknown. And for the first time, that didn't feel like a problem. The book stayed on the desk after it was closed, resting where the light from the lamp touched its cover. It no longer felt like a task waiting to be completed. It felt like something that could be returned to without pressure. The person leaned back in the chair and let their eyes move away from the page. The room came back into focus. The quiet corners, the soft shadows, the hum of the lamp. The body noticed how much tension had drained out of the shoulders without being asked. There was a subtle relief in stopping without finishing. Not everything needed to be carried to its conclusion in one sitting. Not every beginning required a full commitment to the ending. Sometimes starting was enough. Sometimes staying with the first chapter was the whole practice. The mind, of course, didn't disappear. It returned with familiar concerns. What if you never finish? What if this is another thing you leave incomplete? The questions carried a tone of accusation, like unfinished things said something permanent about who you were. The person recognized that voice. It wasn't new. It had shown up in many forms over the years, around projects, relationships, plans, and goals. It measured worth by outcomes. It treated the final chapter as the only one that mattered. But sitting there now with the book closed and the room quiet, that belief felt thinner than it used to. Life, after all, wasn't a single story with one neat ending. It was many chapters, some finished, some paused, some never fully written. Meaning didn't come only from how things ended. It came from how they were lived while they were happening. The person picked the book up again, not to read, but to feel its weight. It felt different now, less heavy, less loaded with expectation. Just paper and ink waiting patiently. There was an unexpected tenderness in that patience. The mind had spent so much time worrying about the last pages of things, about how careers would turn out, how relationships would end, how choices would look in hindsight. That worry had always felt like responsibility, like maturity. But maybe it was something else. Maybe it was a refusal to be where you actually are. Thinking about the ending pulls attention out of the present. It turns today into a rehearsal instead of a lived moment. It makes chapter 1 feel like an obstacle instead of a beginning. The person set the book back down and stood up, stretching slowly. The chair creaked softly. The body felt grounded, not rushed. Outside the window, the sky had darkened further. Lights flicked on in neighboring buildings. Evening had arrived without asking whether anyone felt ready for it. The person moved through the room doing small things, straightening a stack of papers, rinsing a mug in the sink, turning off the lamp. Each action felt simple, unburdened by the need to lead somewhere else. The book remained unread beyond its opening pages. And that was okay. There would be time, or maybe there wouldn't. Either way, the value of the moment wasn't dependent on how the story ended. There was a quiet shift happening deeper than the book itself. A shift in how beginnings were approached. Less like tests to pass, more like invitations to step into what's here now. The mind still had habits. It would likely jump ahead again tomorrow. It would still worry about outcomes, about whether things would work out, about how the story should go. But now there was another option available. When the urge to flip to the last chapter appeared, it could be noticed and gently set aside. When anxiety about the ending arose, attention could return to the sentence in front of you, to the page you're actually on. Chapter 1 was enough. The person paused at the desk one last time before leaving the room, hand resting briefly on the book's cover. There was no promise made to finish it, no deadline set, just a quiet acknowledgement that the story would unfold at its own pace. The ending could wait. Tonight it was enough to have read a few pages, enough to have stayed with the beginning without rushing past it, enough to trust that the story didn't need to be controlled to be worth reading. The room darkened as the light was turned off. The book disappeared into shadow, still unread in so many places. And yet something important had already been read, not from the book, but from the moment itself. A simple understanding settled in. You don't have to live at the end of the story. You're allowed to be where you are, right here. Wherever you are tonight, I'm grateful you chose to spend this quiet time here. If these stories help you rest, you're welcome to subscribe and return whenever you need a gentle place to land. And now, you don't need to do anything more. Let the night hold what you can't carry. And if sleep comes, let it come.